In 1983, a scientist at the Hawkins National Laboratory suddenly runs out of his office and heads to the elevator. As he enters, he looks really scared and tries to quickly close the elevator door. Unfortunately, the door doesn't close, and as the scientist wonders what's going on, a monstrous creature suddenly drags him out of the elevator. Elsewhere, a boy named Mike invites his friends Will, Dustin, and Lucas to his house to play a game called Dungeons and Dragons. After spending hours on it, Mike's mom, Karen, tells Mike to wrap up the game and let his friends go home. Mike is disappointed to hear this, and he tries to get his mom to let them play for a few more hours, but she refuses. Mike also begs his dad, Ted, to speak to his mom, but the man tells him that it's late already. Following this, Mike ends the gaming session, and his friends all leave on their bikes.
See you tomorrow.
They all head in the same direction, but after Dustin and Lucas reach their homes, Will continues riding his bike because his house is still up ahead. As he keeps going, a weird creature suddenly appears in the middle of the road, and Will rides his bike into the woods and falls. Since the creature is still around, Will leaves his bike at the scene and runs home, but there's no one there. He then looks out the window and sees the monster still coming toward the house. Will immediately tries to call the cops, but unfortunately, he only hears a crackling sound that appears to be coming from the monster.
Hello? Hello?
This gets Will scared, and as he sees the monster opening the door, he runs to the backyard and heads into his parents' old workshop to pick up a gun. After he loads the gun hurriedly, he points it at the door and waits for the monster to come in. However, the monster strangely appears behind him, and the workshop's light bulb suddenly shines brighter. Will looks powerless against the monster, and as he doesn't even try to fight, he gets captured, and the light bulb then works normally again. The next morning, Will's mom, Joyce, prepares to leave for work after arriving late the previous night. Before she heads out, she asks her oldest son, Jonathan, if he already woke Will up.
Where's Will?
But he says his brother is likely still sleeping. Joyce then goes to Will's room to wake him up, but he's nowhere to be found. She immediately returns to the living room to ask Jonathan if Will came back from Will's house the previous night, but he says he doesn't know. Joyce doesn't sound happy to hear this.
You don't know?
But Jonathan explains that he stayed at work for an extra shift. Joyce then calls Karen to ask if Will is at her house. Unfortunately, Karen says that Will left after his game with his friends. And even though Joyce is bothered by this, she mentions that her son might have gone to school early. Elsewhere, Mike, Dustin, and Lucas arrive at school and look worried about Will's sudden disappearance. As they wonder where he might have gone,
That's weird. I don't see him.
they get approached by two bullies who make fun of them for being nerds. However, the boys don't seem to care, and they eventually head to class. Meanwhile, Joyce realizes that her son is not at school, so she goes to report to the town's police chief, Jim. After telling him all that she knows regarding where Will went, Jim says it's likely just a case of the boy running out of town, but Joyce mentions that her son is not like that. As she insists that he needs to take the case seriously, Jim asks about Joyce's ex-husband, Lonnie, but she says she doesn't think Will went to his place.
Find him.
Jim says it's important to call Lonnie to ask, and Joyce mentions that she'll do it as long as the police chief keeps trying to find her son. Elsewhere, Mike, Dustin, and Lucas meet their science teacher, Mr. Scott, to ask if the radio devices for their AV club have arrived. Scott tells them it's already in the AV club's office, and the boys look excited about this. After Scott takes them to check out the devices,
Oh, man.
Jim arrives at the school and asks to speak to them regarding their friend's disappearance. Unfortunately, the boys don't have any information to help Jim, but they offer to help find their friend. However, Jim insists that he wants them to go home. Elsewhere, the scientists at Hawkins' lab, led by a doctor named Martin, go into a room with an organic vessel from which the monster escaped. Martin seems intrigued by it, and as one of his colleagues asks about a girl who was in the lab before the monster escaped, he says she couldn't have gone far.
She can't have gone far.
Meanwhile, a strange girl wearing a hospital gown wanders around the woods until she sees a restaurant owned by a man named Benny. She eventually sneaks into the kitchen and tries to steal a plate of chips while Benny is talking to his customers. As she starts eating the chips, Benny sees her and immediately runs to grab her for stealing. However, when he sees her wearing a hospital gown, he offers her more food because he believes she's lost.
Got a deal?
He then asks for her name and where she's from, but the girl doesn't say anything. Benny eventually sees the number 11 tattooed on the girl's arm, and as he asks what it means, the girl points at herself and says it's her name. Benny is shocked by this, but he leaves the girl to eat while he calls social services. Meanwhile, Jim takes 2 officers, Callahan and Powell, to check the route Will follows daily to reach home. As they move around, Jim sees Will's bike near the woods and wonders why the boy left it there. At Will's house, Joyce calls Lonnie to ask if her son is with him, but his girlfriend answers the phone and says he's not around. Joyce is frustrated by this, and as she complains about the situation, it turns out that some agents at Hawkins' lab are monitoring all the calls in the town. Shortly after, Jim arrives at the house and tells Joyce about the bike he found. He also says he needs to check around the house because there's a possibility that Will came home.
Maybe he came home.
Joyce thinks he's wasting time, but Jim still does his job and finds a dent in the wall that was likely caused by someone pushing the door too hard on it. Jim asks Joyce about this, but she says she's unsure if it has always been like that. As he hears the dog barking in the backyard, Jim goes out to check what's happening. He then sees the old workshop and goes inside to check for any clue that might help find Will. After looking around, Jim sees bullet cases on a bench as well as a broken part of the shed. The light bulb suddenly goes off, and this surprises Jim, who believes something suspicious happened inside the workshop. Before he looks any further, Callahan startles him, and Jim then goes outside to inform his officers that they need to set up a search party. Later that night, while Mike is having dinner with his family, he mentions that he would love to join the search party, but Karen thinks it's a bad idea to leave the house until she's sure Will is fine. Mike doesn't like this, but Karen says the rule applies to everyone in the house.
End of discussion.
Despite this, Mike's sister, Nancy, mentions that she needs to go out to study with her best friend, Barbara. Karen refuses to let her go, and as Nancy complains about it, Mike says he doesn't understand why she's pissed, because he knows she'll end up going to see her boyfriend, Steve. Karen is shocked to hear this, but Nancy denies it and insults her brother before leaving the table.
Come back!
Mike also leaves and heads to his room to communicate with Lucas using a walkie-talkie. He then mentions that even though his parents don't want him to go out, he thinks it's important to join the search party. Lucas agrees with this, and Mike tells him to inform Dustin so they can meet up to start their search for Will. Elsewhere, someone rings the doorbell at Benny's restaurant, and as he goes to check, he sees a lady who says she's from social services.
Connie Fraser, social services.
Benny is shocked to see that she came so early, but as he still takes her to 11, she shoots and kills him immediately. 11 sees this and runs toward the back, but 2 agents are already there. As Martin then leads some other agents into the restaurant, they head to the back and see that 11 has killed the agents and fled the scene. Meanwhile, Joyce looks quite worried about Will, and as she also apologizes to Jonathan for not being there for her kids as much as they would have wanted, a call comes in. Joyce immediately answers the phone, but she only hears someone breathing. She eventually hears a monster growling, but as the breathing persists, she believes it's Will. As she shouts for her son's captor to free him, a massive electrical spark surges through the phone and gets it fried. Joyce immediately drops it, but Jonathan picks it up and tries to hear Will's voice. Unfortunately, he doesn't hear anything, but when he asks his mom what happened, she says she could hear Will's breathing over the phone. Elsewhere, Mike and his friends arrive at the part of the woods where Will's bike was last seen.
Wait up!
Even though they seem scared, they still search the woods for their friend. After a while, they hear something moving through the woods, and as they look scared, they suddenly see 11. Despite not knowing her, Mike takes 11 to the basement in his house, and the boys then ask her several questions about where she's from. However, 11 just stares at them without saying anything. After Mike eventually gives her new clothes,
Here, these are clean, okay?
Dustin and Lucas suggest sending 11 out because she's weird. Mike says she has likely been through a lot and that he'll let her stay for the night. His friends are unsure about this plan, but Mike says he'll take her out in the morning and make her knock on the front door so that his mom can help her. Following this, Dustin and Lucas head home, and as Mike asks 11 for her name, she shows him her tattoo.
11. Okay.
The next morning, Jim arrives at Joyce's house to ask about the call from the previous night. Joyce says she's sure that she heard her son's breathing, but Jim thinks it could just be a prank call. Joyce doesn't think so, and she asks if he wouldn't recognize his late daughter's breathing if she was the one who called. Jim doesn't say anything about this, but as he asks if she has already heard from Lonnie, Joyce says she hasn't. He then mentions that he'll head to the city to check on Lonnie. On his way out, Jonathan tells Jim to let him find Lonnie, but the police chief tells him to stay with his mom instead.
Stay here with your mom.
Elsewhere, Mike takes an extra pancake for breakfast and gives it to 11 without letting his parents know that someone is in the basement. He then tells her to go outside and knock on the door as planned, but 11 says she doesn't want to do that. Mike looks confused, but 11 tells him that some bad men are looking for her, since she might truly be in danger. Mike decides to let 11 stay in the basement a little longer.
All right, I'll be back. Just stay here, okay?
Meanwhile, Nancy arrives at school and is invited to a party at Steve's house. Even though she doesn't like school parties, Nancy seems interested in partying with her boyfriend, even though Barbara doesn't like the idea. Shortly after, Jonathan enters the school to drop posters about Will's disappearance. Steve and his friends joke about how weird he is, but Nancy is not a fan of this. She then goes to tell him how sorry she feels for him about the situation. Jonathan thanks her for this, and after she walks away, he leaves school and heads to the city to check on Lonnie. Elsewhere, the agents at Hawkins' lab inform Martin of the call Joyce received the previous night, since this might point them to clues on how to find the monster or 11. Martin sends out a team to check the house. After Joyce leaves to get a new phone at the store where she works, Martin's agents go to her house and check the surroundings for signs of organic particles. Even though they don't initially find anything, the agents eventually see some organic substances in the workshop, which helps them confirm that the monster was there.
Extraordinary.
Elsewhere, Mike doesn't show up at school, and his friends start to wonder if his parents have already caught him hiding 11 in the basement. However, it turns out that after his parents left home, Mike went back to stay with 11. After showing her around the house, she sees Will's picture and looks scared as she points at him. Mike asks if she has seen him before, but before she responds, Karen returns home from work. Mike quickly tries to hide 11 in the closet, but she refuses to go in. He eventually promises to come back for her.
Please.
And this makes her change her mind. As she enters, though, she suddenly remembers how she was thrown into a small cell while she was being experimented on in the lab. Meanwhile, Karen looks shocked to see Mike at home, but he lies to her that he decided to stay back because he wasn't feeling well. Karen assumes that he's having a hard time dealing with Will's disappearance, so she says she understands why he didn't want to go to school. After she leaves him, he then goes to meet 11 and sees her crying, though she says she's fine.
Promise.
Elsewhere, Jim and his officers are informed of what happened to Benny, and as they get to the restaurant, they look shocked to see the man dead. They also wonder why bad things are suddenly happening in the town. Shortly after, they interview a man who saw Benny earlier in the day before he died. As the man talks about what he saw, he mentions that Benny caught a kid with a shaved head trying to steal food in the kitchen. Jim sounds surprised, but he asks the man if the kid he saw might have been Will. The man says that even though the kid looked like a boy, he's not sure if it was Will.
What do you look like?
This leaves Jim confused, and he starts wondering why Will would not only shave his head, but also try to steal food from Benny. Meanwhile, Jonathan arrives in the city and sees Lonnie at home with his girlfriend. He immediately starts checking around the house for his younger brother, but Lonnie says that Will is not with him. He then tries to blame Joyce for their son's disappearance, but Jonathan disagrees because he believes his dad is the bad parent.
I know you don't.
Back in the town, Dustin and Lucas arrive at Mike's house to check on their friend. As they see that 11 is still with him, they look surprised, but Mike says she might know where Will is. He also explains how she recognized Will from the photo in his living room. Lucas still thinks it's a bad idea to keep her hidden, and he says he's going to tell Karen. However, as he opens the door, it suddenly gets shut. This leaves the boys scared, but as they look back, they see 11 bleeding through her nose after using her telekinetic abilities to close the door. The boys are shocked by this, but they agree to let her stay hidden. As Mike then asks her about Will,
Do you know where he is?
She turns his game board upside down and uses a character to represent the missing boy while saying he's hiding. Mike asks what she means by this, and she says that Will is hiding from a monster. Elsewhere, Jim and his officers join the search party to continue looking for Will. Suddenly, Scott calls their attention to a torn piece of hospital gown he found near a drain pipe.
You got something?
Jim thinks it might be connected to Will, but as he and his officer trace the other end of the pipe, they see that it leads directly into Hawkins' lab. Meanwhile, Barbara drives Nancy to Steve's house for the party, but she still tries to convince her friend to change her mind about going inside because she doesn't trust Steve and his friends. However, Nancy's mind seems made up, and she tells Barbara that she's sure Steve is a good person.
No, he doesn't.
Following this, Barbara decides to go in with Nancy to ensure she's safe. Elsewhere, Joyce gets another call, and as she answers it, she hears Will breathing again. She also hears his voice, but as she screams for him to tell her where he is, the phone suddenly gets fried again. Joyce breaks down in tears because she knows her son is in danger, but the lights in the room suddenly start blinking. This surprises her, and as she follows the blinking lights, it leads her to Will's room, where loud music is playing, even though no one is inside. After she enters the room, she sees Will's bedside lamp blinking and asks if Will is trying to speak to her. The light suddenly shines brighter, and Joyce assumes that Will is trying to tell her something. As the light goes off, though, she suddenly sees something coming out of the wall. Joyce runs out of the house immediately and enters her car. Before she leaves, she sees the lights blinking again, so she goes back inside. Meanwhile, Jonathan has returned to the town, and as he's looking around the woods for his brother, he also takes some pictures. Shortly after, he suddenly hears someone screaming, but as he goes closer, he sees Nancy enjoying herself at Steve's party. He also watches as she drinks a beer and encourages Barbara to drink as well. Even though Barbara doesn't want to do this, she eventually takes the beer from Nancy. However, as she tries to open it, she cuts herself and starts bleeding. After a while, Barbara tells Nancy that they need to go home, but she says she's not ready to leave. She also tells Barbara to leave if she wants, and her friend looks disappointed.
This isn't you.
Jonathan continues watching them from the woods, and he also takes several pictures of everyone at the party. Despite what Nancy said, Barbara sits by the pool alone and waits for her friend. Jonathan takes her pictures there, but his camera suddenly stops working. As he tries to fix it, Barbara's hand appears to still be bleeding, and a drop of her blood enters the pool. Suddenly, she hears something behind her, and as she looks back, she gets attacked by a monster. Jonathan hears her voice and looks up, only to see that Barbara is no longer sitting by the pool. He then assumes that she probably went back in, so he leaves. Meanwhile, Barbara finds herself in an alternate world where Steve's house looks abandoned. As she tries to escape the abandoned pool she fell into, the monster grabs her legs. Barbara tries to call for help, but no one hears her, and the monster takes her away. Much later, Nancy leaves Steve's house and arrives home, only to be scolded by Karen,
I scared you?
who asks why she's late. Nancy says she was at a school program for Will, but as her mom asks more questions, she just heads to her room. The next morning, Jonathan hears his mom talking to herself in Will's room. As he asks what's wrong with her, Joyce says that Will has been trying to talk to her through the lights. Jonathan looks confused and asks what she means, so Joyce tells Will to show her what he did the previous night. Suddenly, a light bulb comes on, and Joyce says it's Will. However, Jonathan thinks she's only making things up because the electricity in the house has been acting up for a while. As she says she needs to take more lamps to Will's room, Jonathan stops her and begs her to get some sleep instead. He adds that Will is just lost, and he'll be found soon. Joyce decides to listen to her son.
All right, I'll go make breakfast.
But as he heads out, she starts putting up Christmas lights around the house. When she runs out of lights, she heads to her workplace to buy more. Meanwhile, Mike and his friends decide to search the woods after school to find Will. As they prepare to leave for school, Mike gives Eleven his wristwatch and tells her to meet him in the woods at a particular time. Eleven agrees to do this, and as the boys leave, she gets bored using her powers and decides to walk around the house. As she does so, she eventually puts on on the TV, and this triggers her to remember a time at the lab when Martin made her crush a metal can with her mind. Elsewhere, Nancy arrives at school and notices that Barbara is absent. Since this is strange because her friend never misses school, Nancy calls Barbara's mom to ask if Barbara came home last night. Barbara's mom sounds shocked because she expected her daughter to spend the night at Nancy's house. Nancy remembers that her friend had to lie to her mom to attend Steve's party, so she lies to Barbara's mom and tells her that they spent the night together. She adds that the call is also a mistake because Barbara is in the library.
Sorry to bother you.
After the call ends, Nancy looks worried because her friend could be in danger. Elsewhere, Jim and his officers drive to the gate of Hawkins' lab to continue their investigation, but they're not allowed in. Jim eventually begs the guard at the gate to help him speak to his boss, and after a while, the cops are allowed to go in. They then meet an agent at the lab who says it's impossible for Will to have entered the lab without their knowledge. Since he says there are several cameras that would have seen the boy, Jim asks if he can see footage from that night. As they enter the building, Jim sees a blocked-off section and asks the agent about the work they do in the lab. The man says he's the wrong guy to ask, and as Jim asks who is in charge, he says it's Martin. Shortly after, Jim sees the footage and confirms that no one came out of the hole. However, as he leaves with his officers, he tells them that he believes the agents are hiding something because none of the footage showed signs of rainfall, even though rain fell in the area on the first night they went out to look for Will.
Yeah, a lot of rain that night. See any rain on that tape?
Following this, Jim and Powell head to the town library to check all they can find on Hawkins' lab. Surprisingly, they find out that it belongs to the Department of Energy, and there have been reports of people being experimented on inside the lab. Jim also finds a story about a woman who wanted to sue the lab for taking her daughter. Back at the school, Jonathan prints the photos he took the other day, but one of Steve's friends sees them. Later that day, Steve confronts Jonathan about the pictures, but he says he didn't mean any harm.
I was looking for my brother.
Steve doesn't believe this, and he tears the pictures and breaks Jonathan's camera. Nancy also sees a torn picture of Barbara sitting by the pool, so she picks up the pieces and leaves. Meanwhile, Karen visits Joyce with her little baby, Holly. As she enters the house, she sees the Christmas lights and looks surprised, though she doesn't say anything about it. Suddenly, Holly sees the Christmas lights coming on and directing her toward Will's room. As she goes in, Karen and Joyce realize that the little girl is no longer in the living room with them.
Where's Holly?
While Holly looks around Will's room, she sees something coming out of the wall, but Joyce quickly takes her away. She then asks if the girl saw anything in the wall, but as Karen wonders what she's talking about, Joyce says they need to leave. Elsewhere, Eleven heads out to meet Mike and his friends at the planned meeting point. Before they get there, Eleven sees a cat and remembers how Martin tried to get her to kill one using her mind. When she refused to do it, Martin instructed some guards to take her back to her cell. After they drop her there, Eleven suddenly used her powers to kill the men, though this made her weak. Martin looks amazed by what she has done, and he calls her incredible before taking her out of the cell. Shortly after, Mike and his friends arrive to pick up Eleven so she can lead them to where she thinks Will is hiding. Elsewhere, Nancy remains bothered by Barbara's disappearance, so she goes to check where her friend parked her car the other day.
I'm sorry.
As she gets there, she sees that Barbara's car is still parked just by the road. This surprises her, so she goes back to Steve's house to check if there are clues that might help find Barbara. When she gets there, she looks around and eventually notices something moving in the woods, just behind Steve's house. As she wonders what it is, she eventually sees the monster and runs home to report to her mom that she thinks something bad has happened to Barbara.
What's the matter?
Meanwhile, Jim and Powell continue looking at the things they found at the library, as Jim sees a report of Martin being part of a CIA research that involved kids. He tells Powell that something seems suspicious about Hawkins' lab. He adds that they likely took Will because he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. Shortly after, Callahan calls Jim to inform him of a new development in the case, so the police chief and Powell immediately leave the library.
I'm saying maybe something happened.
Elsewhere, 11 takes the boys to Will's house, and they look confused because they know that Will is not there. As Mike tries to get 11 to explain why she brought them to the house, Dustin sees some cop cars on the road, so the boys immediately follow them because it might have something to do with Will. Meanwhile, the Christmas lights come on again, and as Joyce holds a pack of the lights, Will surprisingly communicates with her by blinking the lights. Joyce then asks if he's alive, and he signals to her that he is. However, he also signals that he's not safe, since he won't be able to tell her where he is by just blinking the lights. Joyce writes the alphabet on the wall and attaches a light to each letter. She then asks where Will is, and he says he's right there. Joyce doesn't understand this.
I don't know what that means.
But as she asks what she can do to find him, he tells her to run. While she tries to understand what he means, the lights start blinking again, and a monster breaks through the wall and enters the house. Joyce is terrified by this, and she quickly runs out of the house. Elsewhere, Jim and Powell arrive at a nearby river,
Oh God, please tell me it's not the kid.
where they see Will's body being pulled out of the water. As Mike and his friends see this, they look extremely shocked because their friend is gone. Mike then shouts at 11 for wasting their time and trying to give them hope. 11 looks confused because she doesn't think Will is dead, but Mike sounds really angry and leaves the scene even though his friends try to stop him. Shortly after, Joyce runs into the road and bumps into Jonathan. As she hugs him and tries to explain what happened, Jim and his officers arrive at the house to inform her of Will's death. However, Joyce refuses to believe that her son is dead because she just spoke to him through the lights. She also talks about being attacked by a monster with no face, but Jonathan doesn't believe this. Jim thinks she's making things up, but he says it's normal for things like that to happen because he felt the same way when he lost his daughter. Joyce still believes her son is alive, but Jim tells her to at least go to the morgue to check Will's body.
I'm just saying.
Elsewhere, Mike sounds quite pissed at 11 for lying to him that Will was alive. As he says he was hurt by what she did, she feels sorry and then uses her powers to connect with Will through Mike's walkie-talkie. Mike suddenly hears Will singing his favorite song, but as he tries to get his friend to talk back, he doesn't do that. However, this makes Mike believe that Will is alive. The next day, Mike informs Lucas and Dustin about what 11 did the previous night. Lucas no longer trusts 11, but Dustin believes what Mike said because he has seen it in a movie before. As 11 then struggles to connect with Will again, Mike believes she needs a bigger radio to make it easier to locate the missing boy. Following this, Dustin suggests using the radio in the AV club office. Lucas doesn't think it's possible because someone might see 11, so Mike decides to give her a makeover using Nancy's clothes.
Good. You look pretty good.
Meanwhile, Jim gets to the coroner's office and asks his secretary why it's taking so long for Will's body to be released. The woman says she's not aware and that everything just seems odd because her boss wasn't even allowed to do the autopsy. Jim finds this surprising, and as he asks who did it, the secretary says that the state troopers sent someone. Shortly after, Jonathan and Joyce are allowed to look at Will's body from outside the autopsy room. While Jonathan eventually leaves because he can't stand seeing his brother's dead body, Joyce stays back to check if her son's birthmark is in the right place. After a while, she storms out to the reception and tells Jim that the dead kid is not her son. She also refuses to sign a release form, and as she heads out, Jonathan tries to get her to change her mind. However, Joyce insists that the boy inside there is not her son. Elsewhere, Martin sends one of his agents to go through the organic portal at the lab to see if he can find 11. As the man goes in, he suddenly starts yelling that there's something else inside there. Before he gets pulled back,
Reel him in.
the monster kills him, and Martin looks shocked. Meanwhile, Steve tries to get Nancy to avoid telling the cops about his party when she goes in for questioning. Nancy can't believe he's bothered about this, but he says he doesn't want to get in trouble with his parents. Shortly after, Nancy meets with Callahan and Powell to explain what happened that night. She also tells them about what she saw behind Steve's house, but the men don't believe her story. They also mention that they think Barbara just ran out of town.
No, Barb wouldn't do that.
Elsewhere, Mike and his friends bring 11 to their school, but before they can get into the AV club office, Scott tells them to attend the memorial for Will first. During the memorial, Mike sees a bully named Troy, laughing at everyone for being so serious about Will's death. After the program ends, Mike confronts Troy for laughing, but the boy doesn't think he did anything wrong. Mike then pushes him to the floor. But before he can retaliate, Eleven uses her mind to make him freeze and wet himself in front of the other students, who laugh at him. Mike and his friends realize that Eleven is responsible for what happened, but they don't seem bothered. Meanwhile, Nancy sees something behind Barbara in the picture Jonathan took of her. She then goes to meet him to ask if he saw anything. Jonathan says he didn't see anything, and he adds that the figure behind Barbara might be a distortion caused by his camera. Nancy then tells him that she really thought it was a monster because of what she saw behind Steve's house. She eventually brushes off the topic
I don't know what it was.
and decides to leave before he thinks she's crazy. However, Jonathan asks if the monster had no face, and as Nancy says it didn't, he realizes that his mom saw something after all. Shortly after, Jim finds the coroner, Gary, to ask about the autopsy. Gary then mentions that he was quite surprised when the state troopers stopped him from doing his job. Jim asks why he felt surprised, and he says it's because the dead person was just a random kid and not a political figure.
Considering this was Will Byers and not John F. Kennedy.
Jim believes there's something odd about the situation, so he goes to a bar to speak to the trooper who found Will's body. As Jim asks him questions about where Will was found, the man tells him to mind his business. After he leaves the bar, though, Jim attacks him and gets him to reveal that he was actually told to go there to find the body and prevent anyone from getting close. Jim doesn't understand this, but he suddenly notices a car driving away from the bar. As he asks the trooper if he knows who the driver was, the man looks scared and says that Jim will get both of them killed. Meanwhile, Mike and his friends finally take 11 to the AV club office. Coincidentally, Joyce is also trying to speak to her son, and after a while, she hears him calling her from behind a wall. Will's friends also hear this, and they listen to Will talking about how he's in a dark, cold, empty place that looks just like home. Joyce tears the wallpaper and sees Will through an organic portal behind the wall. However, the boy eventually sounds scared and tells his mom that something is coming for him. She immediately tells him to hide and promises to find him, but the wall eventually closes up and the organic portal disappears. Back at the AV club, the radio suddenly sparks and goes up in flames, but Dustin quickly quenches the fire. Mike then sees 11 bleeding through her nose and looking weak, so he tells his friends to help carry her out of the school. Meanwhile, Joyce tears down the wall but sees that there's nothing there, and this makes her wonder if she has just been hallucinating. Since she doesn't know what else to do, she calls Lonnie to come over and stay with her. Shortly after, Jonathan prints a clearer copy of Barbara's picture, and as he and Nancy look at it closely, they realize that there's a monster in the picture. This shocks Jonathan because he thought his mom was making things up. However, Nancy says that if Joyce really spoke to Will, then Barbara could also be alive. Elsewhere, Jim returns to the coroner's office
Hey, Patty.
Need something, Chief?
and beats up the state trooper guarding the room where Will's body has been stored. As he then goes in to check Will's body, he tears it up and sees that it's a fake body filled with wool. Since he has always been suspicious of Hawkins' lab, Jim drives to the back of the lab and cuts the wired fence to sneak in. After he goes in, some agents try to stop him,
Borrow this one?
but he overpowers them and walks right into the sealed part of the building. He eventually finds a small cell with a drawing on the wall, but he doesn't see anyone inside. After a while, he sees the organic portal and looks shocked as he wonders what it is. Before he tries to go through the portal, two agents stop him and knock him out. Elsewhere, Mike and his friends discuss what they heard Will say. Since he mentioned that he was in a place that looked like home, Mike realizes that Will is likely in an alternate version of their world. He also remembers that when 11 talked about Will hiding from a monster, she flipped the game board. This sounds like something the boys have read before, and they realize that Will is in an upside-down version of their world. They then ask 11 if she knows how to get there, but she says she doesn't. Meanwhile, Lonnie comforts Joyce and tells her that she needs to see a doctor after Will's funeral. Joyce doesn't think she's crazy,
This is not that.
But Lonnie says it's important for her to get help. Shortly after, Jonathan comes in and looks surprised to see Lonnie, as he also sees the broken part of the wall. Jonathan asks Joyce if the thing she saw earlier came back. Before she responds, Lonnie tells him not to talk about it anymore. They eventually head to Jonathan's room to speak privately, and there, Lonnie tells his son to stop feeding his mom's imagination. Jonathan says he doesn't think Joyce is crazy, but Lonnie tells him to forget about whatever he thinks he knows.
If not for me, for your mother.
The next day, everyone in town heads for Will's funeral, and Joyce also attends the program because she now believes she was hallucinating the whole time. After the program ends, Jonathan tells Nancy that they need to go to the woods to find the monster and try to kill it so they can save Will and Barbara. Nancy thinks he should tell his mom, but Jonathan decides against it because he doesn't want to worry her.
You want to go out there?
Shortly after, a repair guy arrives at the school to check the damaged radio. After looking at it and learning that only members of the AV club have access to the room, the man leaves and reports to his bosses at Hawkins' lab that he has already found out what they want. It then turns out that Martin and his agents heard everything Will said the previous night on the radio. Meanwhile, Jim suddenly wakes up and finds himself at home. He runs outside to check if he's really at home, and as he confirms this, he goes back inside to check if his place has been bugged. After scattering the whole place, he eventually finds the bug and destroys it. Shortly after, Powell and Callahan come over to his house to tell him about a case of two individuals who just went missing.
Out near Curly.
Jim says he'll handle it later, but before he heads back inside, Powell informs him that it seems Barbara really ran away because the state troopers found her car near a bus station. As Callahan says that the troopers have been doing their jobs for them, Jim thinks about the situation and realizes that the agents at Hawkins' lab are probably covering their tracks.
Markwood.
Elsewhere, Mike and his friends ask Scott if there's a way to get to an upside-down universe. He asks what the kids want with this, but they mention that they're just curious. Scott then explains that they would need a massive amount of energy, more than any human can create. He adds that it will be used to form a gate to the other world. Dustin then asks if there's a way to know if the gate is already open, and Scott says it would definitely affect the Earth's gravitational field.
But I'm afraid it's not very forgiving.
Shortly after, the kids return home and start wondering what to do next. As Lucas and Mike ask Eleven if she knows about any gate to the upside-down world, Dustin discovers that his compass is pointing toward the north, even though he's not facing north. As he remembers what Scott said about the Earth's gravitational field, he tells the others about the compass. They then decide to follow the compass's true north because it might lead them to the gate they're looking for. While the boys seem motivated to head out, Eleven looks scared. She then remembers when Martin made her enter a sealed water tank so she could enter a different world. Elsewhere, Steve tries to get Nancy to hang out with him, but she tells him that she has other things to do. She then goes to meet Jonathan while he's trying to learn how to shoot properly with his gun. Meanwhile, Joyce realizes that Lonnie only came to help her because he wants to take advantage of the situation to sue the company that works near the river where Will's body was found. He tells Joyce that they can use the money to make their lives better, but she sends him away. A while later, Jim comes over to Nancy's house and immediately takes off the light bulbs to be sure the place isn't bugged. He then tells Joyce that she has been right all along about Will being alive. Joyce asks what he means, and he tells her that the body in the morgue is fake. Elsewhere, Eleven begs Mike to turn back because she's tired, but he says he's sure they'll soon get to the gate. After a while, Dustin realizes that the compasses are leading them back home. As he says that there's something wrong with the compasses, Lucas sees fresh blood on Eleven's jacket and realizes that she's the one directing them back home. Mike then asks if she has anything to do with it, but she just says it's not safe. Lucas doesn't believe her, and he says that she's likely the monster that took Will. Mike doesn't like how he's talking to her, and the two boys suddenly start fighting.
Knock it off, you idiot!
While Dustin tries to separate them, Eleven screams and throws Lucas off to hit a metal board. He passes out as a result, and Eleven remembers the time she saw a monster inside inside the other world she entered while she was inside the water tank. Shortly after, Lucas wakes up, but he angrily leaves. Mike and Dustin then notice that 11 is no longer with them. Much later, Nancy and Jonathan venture into the woods to find the monster that took Will and Barbara. While they're at it, they suddenly hear a strange sound, and after looking around, they see a dying deer that was hit by a car. As they wonder how to help the deer, something pulls it away swiftly. Nancy and Jonathan are shocked by this, but they realize that the monster likely took the deer away. As they look around for it, Nancy sees an opening inside a tree with blood dripping from the top. Despite looking scared, she goes inside and finds herself in an upside-down world where the monster is feeding on the deer. She immediately screams for help, but Jonathan can't see her anywhere. As he also walks past the tree she went into, it turns out that the opened part is slowly closing up, but he doesn't see it. Jonathan keeps running around to find Nancy, and as he asks where she is, she says she's right there in the woods. Jonathan doesn't know what this means, but Nancy suddenly stops responding because the monster is getting close to her. Shortly after, Jonathan sees the opening in the tree and realizes that it's where Nancy went into. He then shouts and tells her to follow his voice, but Nancy looks too scared to move. As Jonathan moves close to the hole, Nancy's hand finally appears and he pulls her out. Later that night, Steve decides to check up on Nancy at her house, but as he looks through the window, he sees her with Jonathan. This gets him pissed, and he leaves without letting her know he came to her house. Elsewhere, Joyce asks Jim for more details of what he saw inside Hawkins' lab. He then mentions the cell and the drawing on the wall. As he adds that he's sure the drawing belonged to a kid, Joyce asks what it looked like. Jim says it was a drawing of stick people, but Joyce says it can't be her son because he knows how to draw well.
Maybe it wasn't.
Suddenly, Jim remembers what happened at Benny's restaurant and realizes that he has been chasing the wrong kid instead of Will. Joyce asks what he means, and he tells her that the kid who tried to steal from Benny wasn't Will. He also remembers the story of the woman named Terry, who claimed to have lost her child to Martin and his research. Since the kid who went to Benny's restaurant could be the woman's kid, Jim finds her address and takes Joyce with him to see Terry.
Got it.
When they get to the house, they find Terry's sister, who welcomes them in but says that her sister hasn't spoken in years. Joyce still tries to tell Terry about Will, but the woman doesn't react. Shortly after, Terry's sister tells Jim and Joyce about a CIA research led by Martin that Terry was involved in when she was in college. For the research, Terry was paid to take drugs, after which she would be told to get into an isolation tank filled with salt water. Her sister adds that the research was reportedly meant to explore the capacity of the mind.
I don't think you guys understand.
Joyce and Jim then ask about Terry's daughter, but her sister says the child isn't real because Terry had a miscarriage. She adds that her sister used to believe that her daughter had special abilities. Jim and Joyce are shocked to hear this, but as they ask if there's a possibility that Terry didn't lie, her sister mentions that there are several doctor reports to show that she never had a baby. Jim still believes it could have all been covered up.
Yeah, but that could have been covered up.
But Terry's sister says that he's starting to sound like Terry. Shortly after, Jim and Joyce leave the house and prepare to return to their town. As Joyce looks worried, Jim tells her not to be bothered by Terry's case because he's sure they'll find Will. Elsewhere, Jonathan and Nancy start wondering how they can draw out the monster. Nancy then mentions that the monster might be attracted to blood because Barbara and the dying deer were both bleeding when it caught them.
So you're saying it can detect blood?
Since this gives them a clue on how to draw it out, they decide to start buying supplies to trap and kill it. After they're done shopping for traps and other things they need, Nancy gets insulted by someone who sees her with Jonathan. She eventually realizes that Steve has been talking badly about her to people in the town. As she confronts him and his friends, he accuses her of cheating on him. Nancy realizes that he saw her the previous night, but she says it's not what he thinks. Jonathan soon shows up to defend Nancy, but Steve gets angry and insults the boy's family. This gets him pissed, and he ends up eating Steve before the cops arrive to arrest him. Meanwhile, Dustin tells Mike that he has to apologize to Lucas because he started the fight. Despite feeling reluctant about it, Mike eventually listens to Dustin.
Where are we going?
and they both head to Lucas's house. When they get there, though, Lucas says he'll only accept Mike's apology if he agrees to forget about 11. Mike says he can't do that, but Lucas thinks she's too dangerous to be around them. As Mike still insists that he'll look for her, Lucas walks away and says he's going to find Will on his own. Elsewhere, 11 gets hungry and goes into a nearby store to pick up some snacks. As she leaves without paying, a staff member tries to stop her, but she uses her powers to break the store's front door.
Call the police.
Shortly after, Lucas starts following the compass to lead him to the gate, but his friends are still out to find 11. As they check the woods and shout her name, 11 hears them, but she chooses to ignore them. Not long after, Troy and his best friend show up in the woods to attack the boys. Before the boys can run too far, Troy catches up to them and accuses them of having something to do with how he wet himself the other day. He then threatens to stab Dustin if Mike doesn't jump into a river from the top of a cliff. Troy's friend thinks it's too dangerous because Mike might die, but Troy says he doesn't care. Since Dustin's life is in danger, Mike decides to do it.
All right, just hold on.
But as he falls, he suddenly starts flying until he lands back on top of the cliff. As Mike and the others are shocked by this, 11 shows up and breaks Troy's hand with her mind. Even though he's hurt, he immediately runs away with his best friend. 11 then remembers a time at the lab when Martin told her to make contact with the monster because he believes it's harmless. As she's then submerged in the isolation tank,
Don't focus on them.
11 does as she's told, but the monster suddenly attacks her. 11 screams immediately, and this causes the lights in the experiment room to start sparking. A part of the wall also breaks, and Martin looks confused by this. Back in the present, 11 tells Mike that she was the one who opened the gate to the upside-down world. As she calls herself a monster, Mike and Dustin tell her that she's not one.
No, Ellie, you're not the monster.
While they're then heading home, one of Martin's agents sees them and immediately alerts his boss of where the kids are headed. Following this, Martin leads his crew to load up their guns and leave the lab to find 11. Surprisingly, the compass has already led Lucas to Hawkins' lab, and as he watches what's happening from outside the fence, he sees the agents heading somewhere. Since he saw one of their buses close to his house earlier, Lucas immediately uses his walkie-talkie to inform Mike and Dustin that they need to run away from home, as he also mentions that some bad men are coming for them.
Bad men!
Mike sees a strange bus outside his house. He immediately tells his mom that he needs to leave, but before she can ask where he's going, he heads out with Dustin and 11. Martin and his agents see them leaving, so they follow the kids. Unfortunately, a bus appears in front of them, and as the kids believe they've been caught, 11 suddenly uses her powers to lift the bus and use it to block the other ones coming behind them. With this, the kids are able to ride away to a junkyard. There, Lucas says sorry to 11 for initially not accepting her, and she forgives him. Shortly after, the kids see a helicopter looking for them, so they quickly keep their bikes and hide inside a bus. Meanwhile, Martin and his agents go inside Mike's house to ask his parents if they knew he was hiding a girl in the house. Karen and Ted are shocked to hear this, and they mention that they had no idea.
This girl?
What happened to her hair?
As Martin then asks if they know where their son could be, Karen finds this strange and refuses to say anything. Elsewhere, Jim and Joyce arrive at the police station to get Jonathan released. Before they can do that, though, Jim's officers show him the things they found in Jonathan's car. Jim immediately calls the boy to his office so he can explain himself, but Jonathan says the police chief won't believe him. Jim tells Jonathan to give him a try, and
Why don't you give me a try?
as they get to his office, he and Nancy tell the police chief that they wanted to go after the monster. Joyce can't believe her son wanted to do something so risky, but he says he didn't want to bother her. He also tells her that he now believes everything she said about speaking to Will. Shortly after, Troy's mom comes to the police station to report what happened to her son. Jim hears her shouting at Callahan and Powell because they don't believe her son, so he goes out to calm the situation. As he then tells her to give her statement to the officers, Jim hears her talk about how a weird kid broke her son's arm.
What'd you just say?
Jim immediately asks Troy about the girl, and he says that she has powers and always hangs out with Mike. Jim realizes that she's the one he has been looking for, but as he goes to Mike's house with Jonathan, Joyce, and Nancy, they see that there are already people from Hawkins' lab there. Nancy tries to leave to check if her brother is fine, but Jim tells her to stay back because it's not safe. As he sees a helicopter still hovering around the area, he realizes that the kids haven't been found. So he asks Nancy if there's a place Mike goes when he wants to be alone. Nancy says she has no idea, but
I don't know.
Jonathan mentions that he might have a way to contact the boys. He then heads home and finds Will's walkie-talkie. Jim then uses it to ask the boys where they are, but they don't answer it because they believe it's a setup. After Jim assures them that it's safe to talk to him, Mike finally tells him where they're hiding.
We're here.
Shortly after, some agents from Hawkins' lab arrive at the junkyard to look for them. Just as they're about to check the bus, Jim beats them up and rescues the kids. He then takes them to Will's house to meet Nancy, Jonathan, and Joyce. After a while, the boys tell the others what they know about the Upside Down. They also mention that 11 can find Will and Barbara using a radio. They immediately let her try this, but unfortunately, she's unable to find Will or Barbara.
I can't find them.
While the others then wonder how they can get to the Upside Down, 11 says she can still find Will and Barbara, but she'll need a pool of water, since they'll need to recreate the principle of the isolation tank she used at Hawkins' lab. Dustin calls Scott to ask if he knows how to go about it. Scott doesn't get why the boy is calling so late in the night, but he says he's just curious. Following this,
why are you keeping this curiosity door locked?
Scott teaches him all he needs to know, and after the call ends, he tells Jim and the others that they'll need a lot of salt. Shortly after, they head to the school to take all the salt in the storeroom. They then set up a bath and add all the salt inside until objects start to float on the water. With this, 11 enters the bath and covers her eyes with a pair of goggles. As she then enters the void in the Upside Down, 11 finds Barbara, but she's already dead. This gets her scared, and as she says what she saw, Nancy looks disappointed. 11 continues looking around, and she eventually finds Will looking really pale inside a shed. As Joyce notices that 11 is already with Will, she tells the girl to inform her son that she's coming to save him. 11 does this, and as Will tells her to hurry, everyone hears it through the radio. However, Will suddenly disappears, and 11 leaves the void.
Joyce!
Shortly after, Jim says he's going out to find Will, but Joyce decides to follow him, even though the police chief mentions that it's not safe. Jonathan also wants to come along, but Joyce tells him to stay back. After they leave, Jim drives to the back of Hawkins' lab and cuts the fence to get in. Before he and Joyce go far, though, they are immediately stopped by some guards. Meanwhile, Nancy feels bad about her dead friend, and she tells Jonathan that they need to find the monster. Since their tools are still at the police station, Jonathan suggests getting it first, and she agrees. Following this, the two of them head to the station to take back their box of tools without anyone seeing them. In the Upside Down world, the monster suddenly finds where Will is hiding. As the boy notices that the monster is already outside the shed, he looks really scared. Before he can run away, though, the monster scatters the shed and takes the boy. At Hawkins' lab, Martin tries to make Joyce reveal where 11 is, but she only accuses him of trying to cover his tracks.
I know who you are.
Meanwhile, Jim agrees to let them take 11 as long as they leave the other kids and let him go into the Upside Down world with Joyce. Martin agrees with this, and he lets Jim and Joyce wear protective suits before entering the toxic world. Joyce looks confused as to how Jim got Martin to let them in, but he says that they struck a deal. As they then enter the portal, Martin leads his agents out to finally capture 11. One of his agents then asks why he let Jim and Joyce enter the portal despite knowing all their secrets. Martin then says he's sure they won't make it out alive. Shortly after, Jim and Joyce find the place 11 found Will, but they notice that the shed has been destroyed. Joyce then looks devastated because something might have happened to her son, but Jim tells her that they need to keep looking. Elsewhere, Jonathan and Nancy set up their trap and pour gasoline around it so that they'll be able to burn the monster. They then cut their hands to draw out the monster. While they're waiting for it to show up, someone knocks on the door. and Nancy sees that it's Steve. She tells him to leave, but he says he came to apologize for what he did. Nancy tells him to leave, but as he barges in, he sees their weapons and wonders what's going on. Nancy doesn't answer him, and she even points a gun at him to force him to leave. As they argue about it, the Christmas lights start blinking, and the monster suddenly shows up through the roof. Nancy shoots it immediately, but nothing happens. She then runs into Will's room with Steve and Jonathan to lure the monster to step on the trap. Unfortunately, the monster escapes, and as they get to the living room, Nancy tells Steve that he needs to leave. After he heads out, he sees the lights blinking inside the house, and he looks scared. Suddenly, the lights go off, and the monster enters the house to attack Jonathan. Nancy immediately shoots it and runs out of bullets, but the monster remains unaffected. Before it attacks her, Steve enters the house and hits the monster repeatedly with a baseball bat until it steps on the trap. Jonathan then sets it on fire, and after a while, he uses a fire extinguisher to quench the fire. Interestingly, the monster is no longer in the house, but as they check the trap, they see that it likely got injured before it left. Elsewhere, Martin and his agents arrive at the school, but Mike sees them and immediately alerts his friends that they need to run. As they do this, some guards stop them, but 11 kills them all and passes out. Mike tries to revive her, but Martin then shows up and tells him and his friends to step back. They refuse to do this, but he gets his guards to seize them while he wakes 11 and tells her that he's there to take her home. As she sees him, she tries to tell Mike that he's the bad person she has been referring to, but the lights in the building suddenly start blinking. Mike realizes that the monster has found its way to the school because of the dead agents. Suddenly, the monster breaks through a wall and gets ready to feed on the dead bodies. Martin's guards shoot it severally, but it attacks them all, including Martin. The kids manage to escape to a nearby classroom. And there, Mike tries to make 11 feel better by saying that he'll beg his parents to let her stay in his house. Almost immediately, the monster breaks into the room, and Lucas uses his slingshot to throw stones at it. This doesn't work, but 11 uses her powers to pin the monster to the wall. She then says goodbye to Mike and screams to destroy the monster, but she also vanishes. Meanwhile, Jim and Joyce finally find Will inside the town library. Joyce immediately removes the worm in his mouth, and Jim kills it. As Joyce then tries to revive her son, he doesn't wake up, so Jim tries to help. After beating Will's chest several times, the boy finally wakes up and they return to the real world. He is then taken to a hospital where his mom and brother look happy to see him alive. His friends also come to check up on him and tell him everything he missed. Jim finally leaves the hospital, but on his way to get his car, some agents stop next to him and tell him to enter their car. Instead of complaining, Jim just goes in and says nothing. 1 month later, Will starts playing with his friends again at Mike's house. After they're done for the night, Jonathan picks him up from the house. But before they leave, Nancy gives him a Christmas present. Jonathan thanks her for this.
Merry Christmas.
And as he enters his car, Will asks if he can open the present. Jonathan tells him to open it, and he then finds out that she gave him a new camera. Elsewhere, Jim picks some food from work and heads into the woods to drop it inside a storage box. Following this, he turns back and heads home. Much later, Will joins his family for dinner, and after talking about what he thinks he'll get for Christmas, he leaves the table and says he wants to wash his hand. He then goes into the restroom and vomits a worm into the sink. As he also looks into the mirror, he suddenly sees everywhere around him transform into the upside-down world for a second. This scares him, but he eventually returns to the table to finish up his meal. Joyce notices that something is wrong with him, but as she asks if he's okay, he smiles and says he is. The family then continues their conversation about the Christmas presents.